Hello. When people talk about America's most famous unsolved cases, two names always come up: the Black Dahlia murder from 1947 and the Zodiac killings from the late 1960s. The two are separated by roughly 20 years, and the crimes look nothing alike on the surface, which is why, for decades, both investigators and the public treated them as completely separate, with no proven link between them. But then, the story took an unexpected turn. Not long ago, one of the Zodiac's most infamous ciphers, the 340-character cipher, was cracked by civilian investigators and later confirmed by the FBI. But the short "My Name Is" cipher, the one many people obsess over as a possible identity key, has never been officially solved. Still, that breakthrough reignited a bold theory, one that some researchers now push hard, that the person behind both mysteries may have been the same individual. To understand why that claim even exists, we have to rewind to where the first nightmare began: Los Angeles, 1947. In 1947, Los Angeles was deep in Hollywood's golden age, often dated from the late 1910s into the early 1960s, when the studio system still dominated and the city sold dreams by the mile. With entertainment and industry surging, cinema entered a true golden era, and across the city, studios and production outfits seemed to be everywhere. The prosperity on the silver screen drew in countless young people carrying a movie dream, pouring into the city hoping for a life-changing break, desperate to become a shining star. But reality was far more unforgiving. Aside from a rare lucky few, most people could only struggle to survive. And then, on the morning of January 15, 1947, her body was discovered in a vacant lot in Los Angeles, posed in a way that made the scene feel staged. The victim was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. The young woman's dream had been to become a famous actress, and around that same time, a well-known film noir, The Blue Dahlia, had been in the public air around that time. Because she was often described as favoring dark clothing, and with the Blue Dahlia in the cultural background, reporters coined a nickname that stuck: the Black Dahlia. The story went nationwide fast, and what made people shudder most were the traces the killer left at the scene. The killer displayed a terrifying kind of professionalism, as if he had practiced carefully in advance. And after the murder, he didn't simply hide, he even proactively contacted the media and the police, kicking off a cat-and-mouse game meant to taunt and challenge them. The victim's personal items, along with taunting messages, were sent to the media, and police collected and analyzed what they could, while the media competed to publish updates, triggering widespread panic at the time. Police chased thousands of leads and questioned huge numbers of people, but no one was ever charged, and the case went cold. Time passed in a flash, and 20 years later, in the late 1960s, a killer calling himself the Zodiac emerged and terrorized Northern California. In the cases widely credited to him, there were 4 confirmed attacks and 5 deaths, and he shared the same habit of sending letters to newspapers, publicly mocking police incompetence. Notably, he included multiple ciphers, most famously the 408-symbol cipher and the 340-symbol cipher, plus the shorter "My Name Is" 13-symbol cipher and a 32-symbol code tied to his bomb threat. Among them, the one that drove people the most crazy was the Z13 "My Name Is" cipher, only 13 symbols long, and what made it especially eerie was that right before that cipher, the killer deliberately wrote the English words "My Name Is." For decades, people believed that cipher was the key to the Zodiac's real identity, but it was unbelievably difficult. For decades, both professionals and civilian codebreakers have tried, and there's still no officially accepted solution. For many victims' families, those decades were a long, grinding kind of torture. Many of them watched their black hair turn to gray with one single wish. They wanted to know who that monster really was before they closed their eyes for the last time. That stubborn search for truth finally hit a turning point in the 21st century. In late 2025, with AI-assisted methods, a self-taught civilian codebreaker claimed he had made a breakthrough on Z13, and when he compared his proposed name against names that had surfaced in the Black Dahlia investigation decades earlier, an eerie overlap seemed to emerge. A lot of people would assume cracking a half-century-old cipher like that would have to come from an elite agency, but the surprise is that the person making the claim was a civilian codebreaker named Alex Baber. At the time, Baber was 50 years old and based in West Virginia. He wasn't a government agent at all, but he did have one trait that mattered here in a very specific way. Some reporting describes him as being on the autism spectrum. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition that can affect how people communicate, socially interact, learn, and behave, and some autistic people also report unusually intense focus or a strong preference for detail in specific areas. For Baber, that seemed to translate to an ability to stay locked onto a single problem, especially one involving patterns, structure, and strict rules, and to chase connections most people would overlook. In fact, when the Zodiac killings were happening in California, Baber hadn't even been born yet. But as he grew up, he developed a deep fascination with famous cold cases like this.
Eventually, he organized a small civilian research effort, pulling in like-minded collaborators to dig into cases that history had nearly swallowed. On his research list, the Zodiac's 4 ciphers were always a central target, and 2 had already been solved publicly. Z408 was cracked within days of its release, and Z340 was solved in 2020 by private citizens, later acknowledged by the FBI. But frustratingly, the content of both ciphers was mostly just taunts aimed at police, and neither one revealed the killer's true identity. Z13, the one we mentioned earlier, felt different because it begins with the phrase, "my name is," which led people to believe it was the cipher most likely to contain the Zodiac's real name. Baber made Z13 his #1 mission. He used AI to generate possible names that fit a 13-character constraint, and the program's first output was overwhelming, about 71 million candidates. Staring down tens of millions of options, Baber and his team started a long, grinding research journey. Put simply, the 13 mystery symbols followed a particular structure, so they began by applying cryptographic logic to eliminate names that couldn't fit that structure. Then the real vetting process began. The team cross-checked old witness statements, public archival records, and government census data. Through repeated rounds of filtering, the list dropped from tens of millions to 180 names, then narrowed again to just 14. Baber then dug deep into the backgrounds of those remaining candidates until everything, at least in his view, kept converging on one name: Marvin Merrill. The name Marvin Merrill neatly fits the 13-character format, and its internal repetition is striking: 2 M's, 3 R's, and 2 L's. And when you look back at Z13, you see a shockingly similar repetition pattern in the symbols. In those 13 symbols, under this proposed reading, there appear to be patterns that could line up as exactly 2 A's, 2 M's, 2 L's, and 3 strange circle-like marks. The name Marvin Merrill might sound unfamiliar at first, but if you bring up another identity linked to it, Marvin Margolis, a lot of true crime researchers would feel a cold shiver crawl up their backs, because Margolis appears on a 22 suspect list identified by the district attorney's office in the Black Dahlia investigation. In 1947, when the Black Dahlia case happened, Marvin was only in his early 20s, and by the late 1960s, when the Zodiac terrorized California, he was stepping into middle age. Even though there's no video footage to compare, we can still line up a later photo of Marvin with the 1969 composite sketch made from eyewitness accounts in San Francisco. The photo on the left is Marvin in middle age, and the image on the right is a composite sketch drawn in the 1960s based on descriptions from eyewitnesses. The facial similarity between the two is striking. Marvin has a broad forehead and an M-shaped hairline, almost identical to the hairstyle shown in the sketch. And if you look closer at the face details, Marvin has deep nasolabial folds, the kind of lines that run sharply from the sides of the nose down toward the corners of the mouth. Put the two side by side and the suspicion starts to feel heavier. And if the physical resemblance could still be dismissed as coincidence, the records that follow make Marvin look far more suspicious. Marvin wasn't just a random name on a list. He was one of the very few suspects documented as having lived with Elizabeth Short for a brief stretch shortly before her death. At the time, he was a medical student, and that detail matters because the crime scene led Los Angeles investigators to believe the killer had formal medical training. According to the investigative file, 3 months before Elizabeth was murdered, she moved into an apartment in Los Angeles, and the people living there at the time, besides Marvin, included one of Elizabeth's friends and a friend of Marvin's named Robinson. And here's another detail that stands out. Robinson was not an ordinary roommate. Some case researchers describe him as having worked in Army signals/intelligence work, the kind of world built on codes, responsible for cracking complex military ciphers. Robinson's daily world was encryption and decryption, the most advanced methods available at the time, and Marvin, as his close friend, could very well have been exposed to that kind of professional code-making mindset, an influence that could have seeped into the Zodiac letters/cipher mindset later, if the same person truly sat behind both cases. Going back to Elizabeth and Marvin, documents from that period indicate their living arrangement lasted only 12 days, and after that, Elizabeth hurriedly moved out. In the days before the tragedy, she repeatedly told friends she was scared, fearing she was headed towards disaster because of a former boyfriend. One newspaper report from that time, later collected as case material, said Elizabeth had gotten into a dispute with an ex-boyfriend and had even gone to police for help. That same report also noted that Marvin and the roommate, Robinson, were questioned, and they told investigators the last time they saw Elizabeth was in late November, 2 months before the murder.
One detail in the article jumps out. It listed Marvin as 27 years old, but archived records show he was born in 1925, which would make him 22 at the time. That could be sloppy reporting, or it could mean Marvin lied about his age. Either way, Elizabeth's social world was complicated, with multiple romantic ties, and that created massive interference for investigators trying to filter suspects back then. Marvin also provided what appeared to be a clean, airtight alibi, and with that, he successfully slipped out of the spotlight. For years, in research circles around the Black Dahlia case, Marvin's name sat on the edge of the conversation, becoming one of those figures most people barely noticed. So who exactly was Marvin Margolis, the man some researchers think may connect to the name Marvin Merrill? Records indicate he was born in Chicago in 1925. Beyond that, details about his parents' origins vary across retellings and should be treated cautiously. At 18, Marvin joined the U.S. Navy and served in the Medical Corps. By some accounts, he landed with early waves during the Battle of Okinawa. After the war, records describe serious psychological fallout, and he eventually left the service with a disability discharge. Veteran records from the era indicate he moved to Los Angeles and attended USC for a time, though accounts suggest it didn't last long, and it was around that time that he met Elizabeth Short, a young woman his age chasing a shot at fame. Elizabeth had also just moved to Los Angeles to pursue a Hollywood acting dream, and that's where their paths first crossed. At this point, we can see why Marvin is linked to the Black Dahlia case. So why would anyone connect him to the Zodiac 20 years later? Beyond the ciphers we've already talked about, one key clue may be the word Zodiac itself, the name the killer used in the Zodiac case. But according to the newest theory from Alex Baber's side, that word may have already surfaced back in the Black Dahlia case, not as a proven historical link, but as something Baber's team claims to see embedded in later materials tied to the Dahlia narrative, including a drawing they interpret as a confession. So let's rewind again to the late night Elizabeth was killed. Old newspaper reports recorded a few strange witness details. First, in one tip later repeated in retellings, a woman in Long Beach said she heard screams and saw a man pinning a woman down in the back seat, while a man and a woman sat in front. The witness believed there were 4 people in the car, a man and a woman in the front seats, a woman in the back seat, restrained by a 4th person. Baber's camp points out something chilling about that detail. In the witness account, the black car held 4 people, and in the apartment where Marvin and Elizabeth had been staying, there were also 4 people in that household, the numbers matching in a way that feels uncomfortably neat. Later that same night, another report describes a nervous man in a black car around the Compton area, bouncing between motels and insisting on a room with a bathtub. At the time, car culture was booming in America, and roadside motels rose with it. Unlike traditional hotels, they were built along highways, designed for travelers who could pull in and stay with minimal fuss and high anonymity. And for a suspect, that kind of place could mean less attention and a safer hideout. But Baber's side claims there was a detail on the map that many people overlooked. He went back through old newspaper ads and city directories and realized something important had been overlooked.
About 10 miles, roughly 16 kilometers, north of the 3 motels where the suspect had been seen, there was another motel, and its name was the Zodiac Motel. Back then, Zodiac was a popular, attention-grabbing word, astrology was in vogue, and motel names often leaned into that mysterious vibe. That motel no longer exists today, and whether the suspect actually stopped there that night can't be verified, at least not with anything publicly provable today. But another unsettling clue appeared near where Elizabeth was found. About a 4-minute drive from the body, investigators found a discarded ice bag nearby, stamped with an embossed initial, still showing reddish staining according to Baber's reading of the old reports. In the 1940s, ice delivery bags were sometimes marked with a letter, an identifier for the business or route depending on the supplier. So if that embossed letter pointed to the Zodiac Motel, the scattered clues start to look like they're pointing in the same direction, if Baber's premise is correct. In Baber's theory, the Zodiac Motel he points to was in Compton, an older bungalow-style motel complex he says carried that name in period ads. And when you plot the witness sighting of the suspicious car and the location where Elizabeth was found, the points line up along the same route, meaning Elizabeth may have been killed near a motel with the name Zodiac Motel. And if so, then 20 years later, the killer may have reused that same word, Zodiac, as a signature. Supporters of the theory also point to another similarity. In both eras, authorities and newspapers received provocative letters, though in the Dahlia case, many such letters were from someone claiming to be the killer, not something police could conclusively attribute.
So, was the Black Dahlia truly the Zodiac's first victim? Back then, Los Angeles police narrowed in on dozens of men connected to Elizabeth, and Marvin was on that list. But the evidence at the time suggested the last person to see Elizabeth was not Marvin, and on top of that, he had what looked like an airtight alibi, so police ultimately removed him from serious suspicion. Not long after he was cleared, Marvin began using the name Merrill after leaving Los Angeles, moved to Chicago, and became a used car salesman. During that period, he married and had children, but family life was far from smooth, and after a divorce, he entered a second marriage. By 1960, at age 35, Marvin moved to Kansas, and 2 years later, he returned to California and entered the real estate business. If you track Marvin's pattern of career changes, there's a shared thread that's hard to ignore. Whether selling cars or working real estate, both jobs are highly mobile, naturally placing you in unfamiliar neighborhoods day after day. And in most people's eyes, a salesman or a real estate agent showing up anywhere looks normal, not automatically suspicious. So a man with medical knowledge, strong people skills, and the ability to blend into any part of a city returned to California, and soon after he returned, the officially recognized Zodiac case began. If the Black Dahlia was a scar left behind by Hollywood's golden age, then the Zodiac, 20 years later, plunged America into a panic that lasted for decades. From 1968 to 1969, California saw a series of attacks, and the offender was strange. He didn't seem to want money, and no clear motive appeared on the surface, and that senselessness left investigators deeply confused. The investigation quickly bogged down, and what truly made the case feel unreal was the killer's brazen behavior after the attacks. He actively mailed letters to police, and in those letters, he dubbed himself the Zodiac. He sent 4 ciphers packed with odd symbols and letters, and he even taunted the public, implying his identity was bound up in that "my name is" cipher. Police gathered physical evidence and witness statements, but the killer seemed to vanish from the earth. Investigators pinned their last best hope on Z13, but for decades, Z13 remained unsolved until Alex Baber, a self-taught civilian codebreaker, said he used AI-assisted filtering and ultimately proposed the name Marvin Merrill, which Baber links to Marvin Margolis. Once that name was on the table, details that had been ignored began snapping into alignment. One of the strongest lines of suspicion centers on where Marvin lived in California, and there's another key point. Although the Zodiac's official timeline begins in 1968, many researchers believe similar crimes may have happened years earlier, and some argue those earlier crimes could also be connected. For example, in April 1962, Oceanside cab driver Raymond Davis was murdered along the California coast, and his cab was later found abandoned about 10 miles from his home, a case many researchers see as an early preview of the Zodiac's pattern. Baber's Cap argues that public records place Marvin in the Oceanside area around that period, and they highlight geographic proximity as another eyebrow-raising coincidence, pointing out that the cab's abandonment site was only a short walk from where Marvin was living at the time. Even now, Baber's team says they still don't have direct proof tying Marvin to the Zodiac's officially confirmed attacks, but in the taxi driver case, suspicion around Marvin remains unusually heavy. Many people ask a reasonable question. If Marvin truly had anything to do with the Zodiac, wouldn't his family have noticed something? After Baber's findings were released, a reporter tracked down Marvin's son, and the son said that during those years, Marvin seemed like a normal father who worked hard and showed nothing obviously abnormal. Because of that, the son's stance was firm, insisting his father could not have had any connection to the Zodiac case. In his memory, the family wasn't even living in California during that time. He believed they were in Kansas, so his father wouldn't have had the time to commit those crimes. But Baber's camp claimed that during the Zodiac years, Marvin actually had his wife and children living in Vista, Southern California. At the time, Marvin's son was only 16, and for a teenager, memories from decades ago may not remain precise. And Marvin's job at the time, real estate, would have made late-night outings or sudden days-long absences seem work-related. Baber's team raised another possibility as well, suggesting Marvin used his position to rent multiple properties across different parts of California, which would have made it easier for him to move around and commit crimes in multiple areas. Marvin's son strongly rejected that idea, arguing his father was an ordinary man who didn't have the money to pull off something like that. But Baber's side counters that Marvin may have had steady income streams, including veteran-related support, that could have made short-term rentals or travel easier, though that point remains speculative. And if those suspicions weren't disturbing enough, what happened in 1971 felt even eerily perfect in its timing.
Starting in March 1971, the Zodiac letters suddenly stopped without warning, and the silence lasted nearly 3 years. Why would that happen? According to reporting on Baber's theory, Margolis, under an alias, ran Bucksavers Automotive Repair and Parts Supply in Oceanside in the early 70s and received a 30-day jail term plus 3 years of probation for defrauding customers. He was later charged in connection with defrauding customers. Details vary across summaries, and the case resulted in jail time and probation. And during that same probation window, Zodiac correspondence also went quiet, a timing Baber's side treats as suspicious. Then, by early 1974, his probation period was over and an eerie coincidence followed. In the final days of that very month, a newspaper office received a letter signed Zodiac, often cited as the last Zodiac letter that police officially recognize. That timing only deepened Baber's belief that Marvin was highly likely to be involved. After that, Marvin moved with his wife and children across the country to Atlanta, Georgia, where he started an insurance company and the business did fairly well, but his family life was anything but calm, and his second wife eventually divorced him. In interviews, Marvin's son later recalled old memories that felt deeply unsettling. During one conflict, Marvin suddenly lost control, even threatening the safety of the family, and his wife had to intervene with everything she had to keep it from turning into something worse. Later, Marvin drifted and eventually returned to California, and in 1993 he died, taking whatever secrets he had with him. Police had recovered a small DNA sample from an old envelope, but the amount was too tiny to compare directly. Faced with Baber's claims, Marvin's son could not accept the accusation emotionally, but at the same time he wanted a definitive answer that could prove his father's innocence, so in the end he agreed to cooperate and turned over 200-plus items his father had left behind after his death, hoping an official review would finally close the question. As investigators began sorting through the collection, the boundary between the two legendary cases seemed to blur even further. Out of those 200-plus items, the first object that grabbed attention was a Japanese bayonet, a wartime trophy he'd kept since World War II. According to the investigation, the size and shape of that blade was treated as potentially relevant to a Zodiac-linked victim, and even more unnerving, the bayonet carried a distinctive mark that appeared to match one of the mysterious symbols inside the ciphers. If a weapon match could still be written off as coincidence, the next item was harder to dismiss. A drawing he made about a year before he died, titled Elizabeth. And the Black Dahlia victim's name is Elizabeth Short. And in the drawing, Marvin depicted a long-haired woman showing only the upper body above the waist, but on the woman's body, he deliberately painted a very specific wound, and when investigators compared the placement of that wound, it lined up closely with the injury pattern described in Elizabeth's case. Baber's team views the drawing as a kind of confession, but proving insider-only knowledge is complicated because graphic images and details of the Black Dahlia case had circulated publicly years before his death. Confronted with that suspicion, Marvin's son offered an explanation, saying that when his father painted, there really was a woman named Elizabeth in his life, so the title might have been coincidence. Some skeptics pushed back in a different way, pointing out that the Black Dahlia victim had naturally curly hair, while the woman in the drawing has straight hair. To clarify the issue, Baber's team said the word Zodiac appears to be hidden in the shading of the drawing. That discovery made the entire theory feel heavier, not lighter, and some people speculated that this might have been a private confession, a message Marvin left for himself before the end, because at that time the name hidden in the cipher still hadn't been publicly decoded, and he may have been letting the secret leak out in the only way he could. As Baber's team pushed deeper, they said they uncovered more disturbing sketches, and they claimed Marvin had drawn many other portraits of women as well, with fine details in those drawings that seemed to echo the Black Dahlia case. Beyond those visual clues, top handwriting experts were brought in, and they compared Marvin's handwriting to the taunting letters from back then, finding an unusually high level of overlap in writing habits. For example, when writing the letter M, both writers tended to begin with the left vertical stroke first, then used a smoother, curved motion to complete the rest. What made it even harder to dismiss, they said, was that in everyday writing, Marvin sometimes made certain spelling errors, and those same distinctive errors appeared in the Zodiac letters. From a strict legal standpoint, even if these points were presented in court, they might not meet the standard needed to convict, but when all of them point towards the same person, many people feel the truth is starting to surface. The shock didn't stay limited to civilian research circles either. Veteran experts who have seen major cases their entire careers began leaning towards Baber's conclusion. Ed Giorgio, a mathematician who previously served as a senior cryptographic official at the National Security Agency, reviewed the work carefully and gave the findings high marks, saying Baber's reasoning followed a logical structure.
And if that kind of support speaks to technical credibility, the reactions from seasoned homicide investigators say even more. Rick Jackson, a retired homicide detective, argued the overlap between the two cases was too extensive to ignore, and in his view, the killer could very well have been Marvin. Jackson said Marvin left too many traces across decades, like breadcrumbs scattered along a road, and now those pieces were finally forming a picture. Still, skepticism never disappeared. Many longtime observers of both cases argue that Baber's theory still lacks firm legal proof, and in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, one critic offered a harsh assessment, saying Baber had no officially recognized investigative authority and calling the work a lot of empty calories, more stitching than proof. To many people, the methods in the two cases feel too different, and they struggle to believe one person's style could shift that dramatically over 20 years. And when it comes to the people closest to the center of this storm, Marvin's son still defends his father to this day. During the Zodiac years, the son was still young, and in his memory, his father was just a normal dad with nothing strange ever appearing in their home and no obviously abnormal behavior. The son also argues that his father changed his last name from Margulis to Marrow for work reasons, not to dodge police, because in that era, American society was not always welcoming towards certain ethnic-sounding names, and Margulis, he believed, carried a stigma that could get someone dismissed before they even had a chance to speak. So Marvin chose a more common surname simply to make a living. But the file raises a timeline problem.
Marvin moved to Atlanta after the 1970s, yet the name change happened back in the 1960s. So looking at the dates, that explanation doesn't fully line up. Nearly 80 years have passed since the Black Dahlia case. Most of the officers who worked it and many who lived through it directly have already died. And for the victim's family, time ran out before they could ever receive a clear answer. In the Zodiac case, one of the surviving victims today is Brian Hartnell, now in his mid-70s. He survived the attack, later became a lawyer, and has carried this story for the rest of his life. And for him, the meaning of the truth likely goes beyond the case itself, an answer he has waited for across half a lifetime. Right now, Baber says the investigation is not finished, claiming another remaining cipher has also been decoded and that its content could directly support the link between the two cases. He says the decoding method is being prepared for verification and will be released publicly soon. And more importantly, he claims the FBI and multiple California law enforcement offices are reviewing these new findings, even though no agency has publicly confirmed the conclusion. So can these two decades-old mysteries finally be closed once and for all? Right now, no one can offer a truly definitive answer, but it's fair to say we may be closer than we've ever been. All of this material, whether you call it evidence or a pattern, may be starting to outline a terrifying possibility, linking two cases that were believed to be separate for more than half a century. And maybe, through the relentless persistence of civilian investigators and new tools, new data, and new ways of cross-checking old records, the fog that's hung over this story for generations may finally be thinning. We may be standing on the threshold of a truth that could completely change how we view these legendary crimes. So was Marvin Merrill truly the shadow that haunted America for decades? And was he the man behind both the Black Dahlia and the Zodiac? The final answer is still out there, but the hope for justice for the victims and real closure on these dark chapters of history has never felt more within reach than it does right now. This pursuit of the truth is still unfolding, and we, the ones watching, will keep watching, because if an answer comes, it'll change the story forever. That's where today's video ends, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.